that you want to see, you got an opportunity to catch it later on YouTube. And hey, let's let that be the bell. Alrighty, howdy, welcome. So everybody in the chat, I'm gonna keep resharing it. There's a Nearpod link. You go in, you should be able to click on that and join the Nearpod. I can see Pintu, Rhonda, Rob. Not sure who else is in our in the session. So the Nearpod is going to let you follow along with what I'm doing and to click the links for yourself, because I'm going to be going a little quick through some of this. I don't want to take a ton of time. Okay. All right. So the name of this session is Equity and Diversity through Open Source Education. It's a bit of a mouthful. Okay. So let me just go ahead and introduce myself real quick. Hi, my name's Brandon Murray. I'm really into computer science education. I'm an open source zealot. And kind of a personal goal of mine is to create a community of teachers sharing, collaborating on computer science curriculum, but using some of the open source tools and the collaboration model that's turned out to be just, such a big deal in the IT world. I want to bring that to us teachers and into the classrooms. Okay. So, let me just, give a little more background. So, let's see. It's kind of hard for me to talk about equity and diversity. All right. So, I kind of feel like, like an imposter, like my beginning, my mom, she had me when she was like a teenager. And I'm lucky that, she's kind of a superhero because she really did a lot for me, including helping me to establish a computing identity. But, we were pretty fortunate. We lived with her dad and her dad's mom, my great grandma. We had kind of stability, and that gave us opportunities, and that really, helped me to find some success. And, my mom went to college and she got married, and, my dad now he's a doctor. And so there was just always kind of this feeling of, oh, I guess I'm okay. I guess like things have worked out for me, and, I don't have to worry. And, that's the privilege. Now, when we talk about underrepresentation of different groups in computing, lack of privilege or disadvantage is oftentimes, partly a culprit there. And so it's kind of hard for me to go ahead and try to talk about how to fix issues that, I never had. But I guess that's what I'm going to try to do. Even when I was a little kid, I always just thought, okay, well, if I'm taken care of, things weren't always so easy, but, I felt like I was taken care of. I thought, well, I should take care of other people. And, being a teacher is one way to do that. And so is what I'm going to go through here. So let's get started on the real deal. Okay. What is open source? I got a little poll here. If you can jump into the Nearpod. Okay. Do you have any experience with open source software? Why don't you guys give an answer? I'm not sure how this works. Can you answer? Do I have to click a button? Okay, there we go. This is just, I'm just trying to see kind of like, where we're at, who's here, and what people's different experience level is. So let's see, Rob, Pintu, Amber, Dan, David, if you guys are on the Nearpod, if you want to give an answer, I'm just gonna move on if I don't see any answers. Right. So Amber, here's part of my pitch. I think there's just not much awareness of open source. Okay, like people just don't know what it is, except you're using it all the time. Anybody ever heard of the Firefox web browser? Anybody ever heard of the Android operating system? We're probably all using open source and we don't even realize it. If you're using, sorry. Right. So okay. So let's move on from this. Let's talk about what open source is. Nice. Right. So I did a couple workshops last summer where I went over like some open source topics. One of the big ones being Linux. Okay. So if you hear Linux, it's often associated with open source. But what is Linux really? Okay. So Linux is quote unquote an operating system, like Android is actually Linux, but Linux isn't the whole operating system. Linux is really just like one program, and if you boot up Android, there's all these other components, and if you boot up a Linux operating system, there's all these other pieces or tools or components to get your computer to be useful. Okay. So in one sense, open source is this ecosystem of these programs, and I use Linux as this sort of signpost that points to this ecosystem of tools. Okay. So you can click that link there. I have a bunch of links to click. It says reference, what is Linux? Okay, so you bundle up your Linux kernel with all these tools. You call that a Linux distribution. So you might have heard of Red Hat or Ubuntu Linux. Okay, but like, how is it that you can get this stuff? How does this, why is this something that's like useful or important at all? Like, what does this have to do with open source? Okay, so open source is sort of made possible through a kind of fancy licensing scheme. Okay. Like the idea that you can read someone's source code, open source, that's just one component of what makes this thing powerful. So normal copyright says, hey, you can't copy my stuff or do anything to it without my permission. And if you make any sort of creative work of art, or in the case of software, source code, as soon as you create it, you have the copyright. And there's a legal minefield in that. So back in the 80s, some people said, hey, we don't want all this software copyright. We want to be able to share it without having to, worry about legality. So there's this idea of copy left. You might have heard of free software, open source software. It all kind of originates through this copy left idea, where you put a license on your code that gives people permission to copy it if they want, or change it if they want. They can even give those copies to someone else, right? But sometimes, like in copy left, there's a condition that says if you want to use my stuff and modify it and give it away, whatever changes you make, you have to include the same licensing. Okay. All right. So it can be kind of confusing. There's all these different software licenses. So sometime in the late 90s, this open source initiative, this group wanted to come out with a definition of open source. Okay. So if you click the link, open source definition, you can kind of see a set of criteria that's used to classify a software license as open source. Okay. And I have a nice little link there at the bottom, the TLDR legal. This is actually really nice. We've come up with kind of like an activity to do with your students to get them understanding what open source is. through just the exploration of this licensing scheme. So if I come in here and I want to look up what's called the GPL, the GNU Public License, this is the one that started it all. You're going to see on this site, it'll tell you exactly what's going on with the quote unquote GPL, because these licenses can be they're like usually legalese. It's kind of tough to understand what's going on. So this is a nice resource for just kind of starting to understand that, there's these open source licenses, and yeah, there's a bunch of different types of them, and they all have different features. So here's how we can learn about it. Okay. All right. So, but that's really not what open source is. Open source is also this community of people. Okay. The legal framework of the licenses is one piece. The tools that people have built is another piece, but there's also the community that actually does this. People work together because they're free to build software together to solve problems and help each other out. It started as like volunteers, and that's really a kind of a special, powerful thing, right? So, here on my Nearpod, at first open source was about recreating a free version of Unix, but soon this community of volunteers had built up all these tools, which actually became the foundation of the internet. And so we're all using open source. It's everywhere, okay? Even if we're not aware of it. And as much as it's cool to have these tools, be able to get them, as much as it's cool that I can change it, the coolest thing is what the community of open source people has done. And one big reason why open source is so cool and useful now is sort of the tools that we use to collaborate. So I'm going to take just a second and talk about GitHub. If you haven't heard of it, GitHub, it's where the world builds software. Okay. So you got millions of developers, and this is where they go to collaborate. And they use certain tools, specifically Git, to pull this off. And it's really cool. So I'm going to go into it later, but I have this idea that, what if teachers could use these same tools, like a GitHub, to collaboratively build curriculum? Okay. So I'll explain a little more of that later, but this is a powerful collaboration model. And I think that if we can collaborate together, we can do a lot to improving outcomes for all of our students. Okay. All right. Back to the Nearpod. So if that's what open source is it actually important? Okay. And so you have this idea now in the tech world that open source is just eating up the whole world. So it's not just volunteers anymore. Your biggest tech companies are the biggest contributors, the biggest users of this open source thing. Open source, how it's eating the world. This is IBM. Okay. The whole IT industry is relying on this stuff. Okay. So I have a couple links in there. Red Hat, CIOs, chief information officers. They list all these reasons why open source is so important to them. It's how they perform their digital transformation. It gives them access to the latest benefits. Okay. So, right. This is important in the world. Okay. So if that's the background of kind of open source and where it is now, and I can't go too in depth, but I wanted to just make sure that, people had some sort of foundation in that. So now so now let's talk about diversity in technology and also diversity in open source, because that is actually kind of a big issue. Right? We know tech diversity is just terrible. Okay, I got some links here for some references. 5% of Silicon Valley tech workers are Black, Hispanic, or Indigenous. That's so far away from the sort of representation that would be just equitable. Okay, women, 25% of tech jobs. In the world of open source, it's even worse. So, you can survey some of these folks, and you're finding that, female participation within open source is at 2 to 3%. And there's not perfect stats on this, but that's jaw dropping. All right. And, you got 37% of programmers are ethnic minorities, but only 12% of people in open source identify such. Okay. And so there's got to be a reason for this. And there is. What is the lack of diversity? Why is this happening? Okay. There's a little article over here. You can click the link. Reasons for lack of diversity in open source. It gives you this really vivid and awful case of a lady named Katie Bowman, where they had just used her picture when publicizing this was the image of, let's see, sorry. Event Horizon Telescope, and somehow like her image got on there, and she just got like, people were just brutal to her on the internet. And so what we see is that there are actual reasons, there are actual issues in the tech community and in the open source community that are causing the lack of diversity. Okay, so this is important. There's toxic environments. Some open source communities are unwelcoming. They can be rude. Okay, there's no sense of inclusion. And one of the most kind of horrible cases of this is actually the guy who built the Linux operating system, Linus Torvalds. The Linux kernel development is notorious for just poor behavior and just no care for diversity. Okay, so you got a bad rap, like they get a bad rap because it's true. Okay, now it depends on the project. That's what you're going to kind of see is open source is really just this loosely connected groups of projects, but some of them are bad, right? There is open sexism. You have women who are just like getting treated poorly when they go and try to contribute. You have code bases that have sexist jokes or variable names in them. Okay, that's so off-putting. What woman's going to want to be involved in that? And then these authors on this paper also identify just other existing biases. Maybe are women are they as good at coding? So what they find on GitHub is that women contributions, when they ask to add their contributions to a code base, those requests are less likely to be accepted. Okay. All right. So I think that has to be addressed because that's real. And there are people who, like open source, who don't really don't think it's useful for us because it's problematic. Okay. So let's just talk though about bright spots. It's getting better. What we're seeing is that on some of these open source projects, there's research to say that better diversity improves the project. It makes people more productive. It gives better productivity to the project, and diverse teams make better decisions. Okay, so that's encouraging. Okay, yeah. So due to Mr. Linus Torvalds, who can be just such a jerk, and that sort of culture, different organizations, different developers have come together and said, hey, we can't have this sort of toxic culture. We need to all agree on a set of standards, a set of norms that will encourage inclusion, that will encourage people to feel like they can belong here and they're safe, right? So you can, you can explore this on your own. I think this is a nice step forward. Okay. And there's also just plenty of other active efforts to improve diversity within tech and open source. So, for instance, let's make sure I got it. There's awareness. There's awareness that there's a diversity problem and people are, actively trying to work on this. There's organizations and websites that are trying to get better diversity, that are also just reaching out to underrepresented groups to kind of give them an opportunity and invite them in, right? So, open source, it has diversity problems. Tech has diversity problems, but we're working at it. So, more in general, how do we work at getting more equitable outcomes for our underrepresented groups within the computing field, within computing education? So here we have a report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Okay. And this is like this whole 200-page document that goes into how do we cultivate interest? How do we cultivate interest in competencies in computing? And they have some different suggestions. Okay. Researchers have identified that one of the major barriers for underrepresented groups is the lack of a computing identity within these people, within these students, within these communities. Okay, I was just talking to some girls in my class, and kind of telling them about this presentation. I'm saying, there's women constitute roughly 25% of the IT workforce, and they go, what's IT? It's like, is that technology? Yes, it's technology. So this is actually kind of a monumental barrier. And if women are coming in trying to be involved and they meet hostility, okay, they're not going to feel like they're part of this. I actually saw there was a lady in the event chat who said, I never felt like I belonged in the software or I think she said computer engineering world, and so she left it. So I don't know if I can okay. So I used this report as a basis for trying to understand how do we improve and get computing identity. How do we move forward on that? And their recommendation was we need professionally and personally authentic experiences. Okay. So part of that's role models. And luckily we're getting further along with that. Okay. Young people need to see computing professionals who look like them. It's cool to watch television shows now. You're seeing diverse people have the computer role. But this is not something that necessarily I can go over on this conversation. So, all right, open source as professional authenticity. I have a bunch of different links here, okay? I'm just going to run through this because there's no point in just sticking on this, okay? Whether you're a software engineer or a data scientist, okay? We have all these different people who are saying, yeah, you need to have these different skills, cloud computing, data structures, okay? Git and GitHub, okay? What are the top 10 skills? Most of this stuff is all open source, okay? Data scientists. What are the in-demand skills for data scientists? It's going to be open source tools, okay? So open source is professionally relevant for that side of the IT industry. It's also just relevant for more general, like IT support roles and cybersecurity, okay? Linux certifications are a big deal for IT people. Cybersecurity is kind of built off of you're going to be using Linux tools to perform different things like penetration testing, okay? And we also see that These open source skills are in demand. Companies cannot find enough open source skills, enough open source skilled people to fill their workspace, their workforce. Okay. IBM here saying, in the era of open hybrid cloud, open source skills matter more than proprietary skills. Okay. So, here's what I hear. I hear that open source is a good way to get a job, and that's what people are going to use. Okay. All right. I don't want to linger on this. I'll be sending out, I'm going to share this slide deck with you guys. If you want to take a look at the links later, go right ahead. Okay. All right. So if we're trying to break down some cultural barriers, how do we, the other part was personal authenticity. Okay. So here are a bunch of examples of different ways that people want to solve problems for a community through open source. I mean, this is a really big deal. Humanitarian, free, and open source. That's just this idea that we can work on projects together that solve lessons or that solve problems for folks. Okay, so let me just clean this up. You got IBM over here, call for code for racial justice. There's a bunch of different projects, all open source, for trying to help police and judicial reform and accountability, diverse representation. Okay, policy and legislation reform, all through open source collaborative projects. Okay. Some other examples of projects: Sahana open source disaster management. Ushahidi, this is like a crowdsourced mapping thing for identifying issues in your community. Okay, so here, Safari Seat, open source wheelchair. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna keep going here. All right. So now here's the deal. Does this work? Okay. Is having personally relevant projects, is that gonna help want students to participate in tech, to participate in open source? And so this is a slide that was shared to me by this lady, Heidi Ellis. And this is just they're kind of early in this research, but they see that these sorts of projects with social impact, they might attract women. They said impact on other underrepresented groups, not super clear. Okay, so there is some evidence to suggest that, open source as professionally relevant, open source as personally relevant, interest underrepresented groups. Okay. So there, and right here I can share these are some different success stories that actually using open source to fix stuff. Okay. They had a middle school club that took recycled computers, put Linux on it, and got it to students who needed it during the pandemic. That's pretty cool. Okay. We have projects where they take formerly incarcerated people, teach them a little Python, teach them a little Linux, and are getting them jobs. There's paid internships. Okay. So there is some success out there already. Okay. And so I wanted to go ahead and mention a particular success story. Okay. There's a gentleman here, and he's with us, Mr. Kelsey Hightower. Kelsey, if you want to jump into the chat now, would be a good time. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Kelsey kind of come on and give his experience. Kelsey is a Google engineer. He's from Atlanta, or had lived in Atlanta, and he was nice enough to come in and share his thoughts. So let's see, Mr. Kelsey.
Hey, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yep, I got you.
All right. I kind of was watching the presentation. I think one component maybe people are asking is why? Why open source? And if you think about software these days, it's one of those tools that's necessary to participate in kind of the broader landscape of what's going on in the world, right? So, if you think about the early discoveries of fire, if you learn how to build a fire, you can learn how to cook, you can learn how to use it as a tool. So open source is primarily a tool. Why? Because most things in the world these days are data driven. Your financial records, your credit score, the things going on in your community, if you're starting a business, all of these things are fairly relevant for you. So in order to participate in kind of the new world, I think it's super important to understand what tools are available for doing so. And I think a lot of the things Brandon was covering is that to democratize technology, meaning open source has been a thing that has been in practice for over 30 years that allowed us to democratize large open source, right? This is $1 trillion industry where before everything was proprietary. Now you have open source, which was a counter movement, now has become the industry standard. So these are the tools now that you see at the Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world, the Apples of the world. Even your iPhone that you're using is probably running some open source software. So now the playing field is level. I think now we're trying to tie this back to, as educators, number one, how do you leverage this similar collaboration model? My wife has been in education for a very long time. She's been a teacher, a vice principal, and now she's a director at the school district that I live in. And one thing that was a common theme is every year, every teacher is trying to figure out how to build lesson plans across the entire United States. Everyone is kind of working in isolation. Maybe there are some pockets of collaboration, but that isn't
on the same problems.
On the same problems, right? Math teachers teaching K through 12 are trying to figure out the best way to accomplish that, trying to use new and innovative techniques for doing so. But if one person solves it, if you were to leverage this collaboration model, meaning simply sharing your lesson plans, simply sharing example problem sets so you don't have to create your own, I think what that does is allows us to, number one, not only are we sharing and saving other people time, we can get their ideas to make them slightly better. So when you see tools like GitHub, it's like a repository, right? It's like one way of saying, hey, I've taken my first pass at creating these computer science, example projects so that my students can take them. If you're interested in doing the same thing, you don't need to start from scratch. That's what makes this open source movement so powerful, is that we've been building on top of each other's ideas for 30 years, that we have some really great products and services as a result. And I think education can follow the same trajectory, right? Taking the world's, all the teachers that are trying to create things, but imagine all those teachers of the years sharing their secrets and their lesson plans so that a new teacher that's joining the workforce can start there versus starting from scratch and maybe add a few ideas to the mix. So that's kind of my high level overview. I know, Brandon, you had a few questions, and I'm happy to answer a few of those during this particular section.
Let's look at the time. Why don't we? So how did you get involved in open source? How has it helped your career? I'd like to hear a little about your career, because I think that will help kind of ground this conversation and make it a little more real.
Funny enough, I have the kind of public education system to thank for my introduction into tech. I went to a school in Lovejoy, Georgia, south of Atlanta. And in 10th grade, I was introduced to technology through the TSA program, Technology Student Association, and had an elective where we went to the details. And that's when I first got the idea that, hey, I could actually write software on my calculator, TI Basic on my TI-86 math calculator. And from there, when it was time to make a decision of going to college, I kind of was one of those persons who had the grades but just didn't want to go. So I worked at fast food up until that point. But I got IT certifications because I started building the confidence that I could do that in high school. So from there, I kind of watched a lot of doors open up as my skills increased. So even though I call it self-study and self-learning, the truth is the people who write those books, a lot of the open source projects that I was able to contribute to, gave me the same skills that the highest paid people in technology were also using to get paid. So that was kind of my trajectory. So from high school, and then falling into the open source world, and then collaborating, and then just every couple of years moving to new and better opportunities as my skills grew.
It's just such a cool thing. And I know, just having talked to you and having listened to you, you have a tremendous work ethic. And so that's always going to be a part of it. But it's just really cool to hear your story. And so, thanks for coming on. And so let's, why don't we just go ahead and go talk about kind of the big project that I wanted to work on. Okay. So let's come back. So Kelsey, he's got one foot in education. He's got one foot in this business world, and he's, this open source guru he's a community builder. And so I had reached out to him and said, hey, what do you think about open source in education? So, so we got talking, and he's like, yeah, the tools are cool, and but it's really about the community. It's really about collaboration. And so I had been having this thing kind of going in the back of my head for a little while on, well, how can we use some of these tools, right? So I said, well, shoot, let's just do it. Let's go and create a GitHub organization. Let's go and create little repositories, and let's organize a way to share resources with one another, right? And to collaboratively do it. So if you guys want to, if you want to kind of see what this is all about, you can go to that website. If you want, drop your email in chat, because I can actually kind of get you involved. But the basic idea is, are you teaching CS principles? Are you teaching IDT? Come over here and see what other people have to say. Big idea standards. We got most of the standards in here. And maybe what we can do is we can put links on attached to standards. So links to assignments, links to websites. Thanks, Pintu. And so the cool thing is, we're already collaborating. I don't know if Rob Kramlich, he's a computer science teacher here with me. Him and I are working on this. Rob, do you want to try to jump on? So I can just kind of briefly give a I think there's two things here, Amber. I think the most powerful thing we could do right now is apply the open source mindset and model to this sort of like curriculum collaboration model. Hey, Rob.
Hey.
So Rob, when I came to you with this idea, I don't know. Tell me from your perspective why you would like this, why you'd want to be involved.
Well, I'm a second year teacher, so this is my second year in education, and my second year as a computer science teacher. So last year, just coming into it fresh, I was lucky. My father is one of the other computer science teachers in the county I work in. So I could kind of collaborate with him. Our Sunday night dinners tended to be like collaboration sessions, but outside of that, it's just it's us, and it's like 2 or 3 others in the county that teach the same courses. We're not like the math department that has 5 or 6 math teachers in each school, and then countywide there's maybe 20, 25 that all teach the same stuff. We're limited to just a group of 4 or 5 of us, and maybe between all of us we have 40, 50 years experience, if that. But there's so much more out there, right? So if I create a project that I really like, I share it with them. But outside of that, it's not going anywhere else. And I know that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of CS teachers, K-12 CS teachers across the nation, and everybody's coming up with their own assignments. They're coming up with, sometimes there's a little bit of collaboration, like maybe we come to a conference or we go to an APSI session, and one teacher who's been teaching this for 25 years will share all their stuff. But outside of that, there's no real cross-district collaboration, right? And I think that based off of open source and just like where it's at now and how relevant it is, in the workforce, and how it's relevant to our content, we can utilize that. So when Brandon came to me with this idea, I was kind of hesitant at first, because I really, like I said, I'm a second year CS teacher. A lot of this stuff is relatively new to me. But just the whole idea of the collaborating, the sharing, being able to, for me, if I would have had something like this last year where we maybe had even just 100 contributors, right? We could have, I could go through, I could pick out things and activities and lessons and assignments that work for my students. I could then create my own. And last year I spent so much time creating all these assignments from scratch. And I've got them all saved, and Brandon and I have talked about it, like this, or just adding to this repository, just so we can get started with something, right? And that's not even to say, like, I would create a project, I'd send it to my father, he'd take a look at it, and he'd have a better idea, he'd improve it. I want to grow that on a larger scale. I think Brandon's idea for this repository, it's wonderful, right? That it allows us to collaborate outside of just our districts.
Well, let's take them through kind of what this could look like, because we've been talking about it. One issue with the open source deal is it's kind of hard to get started with. There's a lot to it. Okay, so something like GitHub does something nice for us. It lowers the bar of entry. So say I'm a teacher and I want to go find some resources. Okay, GitHub, great. It's a place that we can host these things. Well, say I'm a teacher who wants to contribute back, right? Now, it's a little tricky, but that's why I'm asking for your emails. If you can email, if I can get your emails and you can get signed up for GitHub, I can invite you into this organization. And in order to add your own stuff, all you have to do is come over here and click this little pencil. And this is using a format called Markdown, but you can kind of see, okay, that's this must be the link. And just come in here and put, my link to my stuff. Okay. And that's all you have to do. And you got to come down here and say, all right, commit my changes, added my stuff. And now we're leveraging these open source tools. Now you've just given back on this shared resource. And I'm grabbing these emails and I'm going to get you guys in. If you want to go create a GitHub account, go do it. All right, Rob, I'm going to unmute you now. You got a little bit of feedback. What? I can't unmute for everyone? How did I break it? I just broke you. I'm very sorry. Okay, there we go.
I got control over myself. Yeah. Well, and what I think, Brandon, the big part with us is, and Brandon was talking to me about this yesterday, is his goal, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to get this just education to leverage these tools. But this is relevant to us as CS teachers. Like, this isn't, it's not like we're English teachers and GitHub would never be really used in any situation. We're computer science teachers. This is real world stuff. We can start here with us because the tools are available. In some cases, they're part of our standards. If they're not, we can easily integrate them into our standards. And so we're a good starting point for this.
What is it? We were messing around on MakeCode, and MakeCode has this GitHub integration. Suddenly the tools that we're already using to conduct our classes, we're starting to see the open source stuff kind of wiggle its way in. And so that was really cool when we figured out how we could have our two classes collaborate on a project.
Yeah. And it's not even just MakeCode, it's everything now. It's if you're using Replit as your IDE, because I know a lot of people are moving away from just your standard IDEs like Eclipse and whatnot for education, because kids have Chromebooks, right? You can't run Eclipse on a Chromebook. So now people are using Replit. Replit's building out like all this entire education sector. Well, now they've got version control with GitHub integration that's in beta. So all this stuff, it's starting to become really relevant to our classes, and I think we need to leverage it.
All right. Okay. So let's see. You guys on the. How much time we got? We got about 7 more minutes. Will, Amber, Rhonda, Amy, Pintu. Did you guys make a GitHub account? Let's go ahead and let's go ahead and see if we can't do this. So I'm getting your information. There was actually something that I saw that was cool earlier in the conference. Here, I'll share this. I found somebody was compiling resources into a Google Doc. So I got access to that, and so here we got a way to come in, and there's already all these links for us, and issue here. This document's just sort of such a first draft. But kind of same idea, just needs a little more organization. So I was hoping to take, some of this and get it into our repos so that we can start building. So let's see. Let's see if we can't. I lost my window. Let's see if we can't get some people added to this GitHub organization. So Miss Rhonda, she's our CSTA president. And so she's been kind of excited about trying out this activity. Oh yeah, here it is. Trying out. I'm like I've lost all my windows. I want to get back. Here. Okay, there we go. All right. So we're going to talk more about this in the CSTA meeting. Rhonda's going to give me a chance just to explain it. But I wanted to do this panel to go over sort of the fundamentals of what open source is and why it can be important to our students. And if we want, I'm gonna go into our organization here and add you guys and see if we can't go and edit one of the files in one of these repos. So people, invite someone. There it was. Sorry. So we got Will. Let's see if I put a comma. Where's my? Here we go. Amy, Will. Okay. Can I do this with a comma? Doesn't look like it. All right. We'll try it later. Okay, not a GitHub member. Oop, maybe it's the comma. There we go.
And even just on, because I don't know if you wrapped it back around, but just using this in our classrooms, just statistically from the statistics you showed earlier of like females that use open source. I mean, for the most part, I'm way above 3%, 2 to 3% females in my classes. Just giving them that introduction in a K through 12 setting, like that has the potential to kind of raise the diversity of open source,
I love it, and there's got to be a sliding scale. Like open source is for educators. It's like a plugin. It's not going to be the curriculum. We have all these standards we have to take, we have to teach, but there are certain places where you can install some of these concepts. Like if you're talking about copyright, we should be talking about open source licenses. I know, Rob, you're getting ready to do a unit on that, and that'll be fun. So we'll see how that goes. But so there's two levels, right? Can we collaborate as teachers using these open source tools because they're really useful for that? And further down the line, can we incorporate more of these concepts into our classes for our students? And I just think that maybe this is a good first way to do it. All right. I'm sorry, I'm being slow on this. And I think we're basically out of time. But let me just get everybody invited who's on this list. So then when it comes time later to talk about this again, we can you guys will be in and you can practice.
And I don't think there's not too much in there right now outside the standards because the repo is relatively new, I believe, right, Brandon?
Yeah. I mean, I made this organization last year, but then I had a kid and I didn't get to building it. But so thanks, Rob, for agreeing to kind of be a part of this. We got a couple other teachers in different districts who want to help out. Miss Rhonda's going to be spreading the word, and we're going to be hopefully doing some different kind of professional development around some of these topics through the Georgia Computer Science Teachers Association. So it's exciting stuff. And so thanks everyone for coming to this, coming to the panel, and thanks Kelsey and thanks Rob for giving your input. I really appreciate you guys. All right, good times. Everybody have a good time? All right, who am I missing? Amber? Miss Rhonda? Member? No. I want to, okay. All right, so you guys will see an email. That'll get you invited. And then here in a bit, we can play around. All right, thanks everyone. I'll hang around. Amber, you didn't? No. All right. All right, I'm dropping out. So, because I got to get ready for my next class. All right, see you guys.